The Galactic Academy of Xenobiology perched on the edge of Epsilon Prime like a metallic tumor, all gleaming spires and pretentious architecture that screamed, "We're very important and intellectually superior. Thank you very much." Inside its hallowed halls, the galaxy's brightest young minds gathered to study the universe's most dangerous creatures, which, according to the curriculum committee, apparently included humans. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Jamie sat in the back row of Advanced Predator Studies, trying very hard not to roll his eyes as Professor Krelian droned on about primitive death world adaptations. The beetle-like alien's mandibles clicked with academic smugness as he gestured toward a holographic display of Earth's most terrifying fauna. A grizzly bear roared silently in three-dimensional glory, eliciting nervous chittering from the other students. "Note the crude musculature," Krelian pontificated, his compound eyes reflecting the classroom's sterile lighting. "This species relies purely on brute force, much like their human contemporaries. No elegance, no sophistication, merely violence." The professor's gaze landed squarely on Jamie, and the human could practically hear the unspoken "present company included" hanging in the recycled air. Around him, his classmates, a delightful collection of crystalline, gelatinous, and scaled beings, shifted uncomfortably. Some shot him sideways glances, as if expecting him to suddenly sprout claws and devour the nearest textbook. Havoc, a crystalline student whose body refracted light like a living prism, raised what might generously be called a hand. "Professor, is it true that humans can survive without backup life support systems on class death worlds?" "Indeed, Havek. Humans are notorious for their ability to thrive in conditions that would liquefy most civilized species." Krelian's mandibles clicked with what Jamie had learned to recognize as alien condescension. They possess an almost supernatural tolerance for pain, toxins, and psychological trauma. Quite barbaric, really. Jamie bit back a sarcastic comment about how barbaric it was to actually adapt to one's environment instead of hiding behind force fields and climate-controlled habitats. He'd learned early in his exchange program that defending humanity's evolutionary choices only reinforced their primitive stereotype. Better to sit quietly and let them think what they wanted. Blort, whose gelatinous form wobbled with nervous energy, gurgled a question. "But why study them if they're so dangerous?" "Excellent question." Krelian's enthusiasm spiked as he clicked to a new holographic display, this one showing various human settlements across the galaxy. "You see, humans have this peculiar tendency to spread. Like a benign infection, if you will. They establish colonies in the most inhospitable locations, form emotional attachments to clearly unsuitable planets, and somehow manage to not only survive, but flourish." The word infection made Jamie's jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. Around him, his classmates absorbed this wisdom with the kind of academic fascination usually reserved for studying particularly virulent diseases. Sindara, whose reptilian features twisted into what Jamie assumed was intellectual curiosity, hissed softly. "Are they truly as unpredictable as the literature suggests?" "Oh, my dear Sindara, you have no idea." Krelian's compound eyes practically sparkled with academic glee. "Humans are perhaps the most chaotic variable in our current galactic ecosystem. Where other species follow logical patterns of behavior, humans operate on what they call gut instincts and emotional responses. They make decisions that defy rational analysis. Jamie wondered if starting an interstellar exchange program to prove humans could be civilized academics counted as one of those irrational decisions. Judging by his current situation, sitting in a classroom where he was discussed like a fascinating but potentially dangerous lab specimen, it probably did. "Which brings me," Krelian continued, his voice taking on the theatrical quality that professors throughout the galaxy seemed genetically programmed to possess, "to today's very special demonstration." The classroom fell silent. Even the ambient hum of the life support system seemed to quiet in anticipation. For the past several rotations, we have discussed theoretical predatory behavior, studying recordings, analyzing behavioral patterns, examining biological adaptations from the safety of our academic environment. Krelian's mandibles clicked rhythmically, like a countdown. But theory, my young scholars, can only take us so far. A chill ran through the room that had nothing to do with the climate control system. Jamie noticed his classmates exchanging glances that ranged from excitement to barely concealed terror. Havek's crystalline form seemed to dim slightly, while Blort's gelatinous mass contracted into a more compact, defensive shape. "Today," Krelian announced, with the kind of dramatic pause that would make a holovision producer weep with joy, "we will observe a live specimen." The collective intake of breath from the alien students was audible. Several of them turned to stare at Jamie, as if expecting him to suddenly transform into his true, predatory form. He fought the urge to wave. Now, Krelian chuckled, clearly enjoying the reaction. "Not our human colleague, though I'm sure Jamie would provide fascinating observational data." "Thanks for that," Jamie thought. "Nothing like being volunteered for vivisection by your professor." "No. Today we have arranged for a genuine predator from the shadow worlds to be brought here for direct observation. A creature so dangerous, so fundamentally alien in its approach to survival, that it has become the stuff of nightmares across 3 sectors, the shadow worlds." Even Jamie had heard whispers about those distant dark planets on the galactic rim, supposedly home to creatures so terrifying that even the most hardened space marines refused deployment there. The kind of places where exploration drones went silent and rescue missions became recovery operations. But surely, Havek's voice cracked slightly as she spoke, surely it will be properly contained. "Of course. We're academics, not suicidal." Krelian's laugh was like glass breaking in reverse. "The specimen will remain within a Class 9 containment field at all times. You'll be able to observe its natural behaviors without any risk to your personal safety." Sindara's forked tongue flicked nervously. What kind of creature are we dealing with, Professor?" Krelian's compound eyes glittered with anticipation. "A nightmare wraith from Umbros 9. The silence that followed was so complete that Jamie could hear his own heartbeat. Around him, his classmates had gone completely still. Not the relaxed stillness of attention, but the frozen stillness of prey animals that had just caught scent of a predator. "I see our reputation precedes us." Krelian chuckled at their reaction. "Yes, nightmare wraiths are considered among the most dangerous sentient predators in known space. They're capable of phasing through solid matter, possess limited telepathic abilities, and are said to feed on fear itself." Blort made a sound like a deflating balloon. "Feed on fear?" "Metaphorically speaking, of course. Though they do seem to become more aggressive when their intended victims display terror." Krelian's tone was the kind of casual that professors used when discussing particularly interesting academic footnotes. Their hunting strategy appears to rely on psychological warfare. They prefer to terrify their prey into a state of helpless panic before moving in for the actual kill. Jamie frowned. Something about that description bothered him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The specimen should be arriving momentarily, Krelian continued, checking a chronometer embedded in his exoskeleton. Security assures me that transport went smoothly, though they did mention the creature seemed unusually docile during transit. As if summoned by his words, the classroom door chimed and slid open. Two figures in full hazmat gear maneuvered a large, cylindrical containment unit into the room. The container was opaque, giving no hint of what lurked within, but it hummed with the distinct energy signature of high-powered containment fields. "Ah! Perfect timing!" Krelian rubbed his mandibles together in anticipation. "Class, I want you to observe not just the creature's physical characteristics, but pay special attention to its behavioral patterns. Note how it moves, how it responds to stimuli, how it assesses its environment for potential prey." The hazmat-suited technicians positioned the container in the center of the classroom, ran a few diagnostics on their handheld devices, and gave Krelian a thumbs up before retreating to what they clearly considered a safe distance. "Now then," Krelian's voice took on the quality of a ringmaster introducing the main attraction. "Let us see what nightmares look like in person." He pressed a control on his lectern, and the containment cylinder's opaque walls shimmered and became transparent. Jamie had been expecting something out of a horror holovid, all teeth and claws and malevolent glowing eyes. What he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat for entirely different reasons. The creature inside was roughly humanoid in shape, but clearly alien, with elongated limbs and a translucent quality to its skin that revealed a complex network of what might have been circulatory or nervous systems underneath. It stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with features that were both beautiful and utterly foreign. Its large, multifaceted eyes were closed, and it swayed slightly as if struggling to remain upright. But what struck Jamie most wasn't the creature's appearance. It was its posture. This wasn't the stance of a predator assessing its prey. This was the posture of something that had given up. Something that was simply waiting. Around him, his classmates whispered in excitement and fear, but Jamie found himself leaning forward, studying the creature more intently. There was something wrong with this picture, something that didn't match Krelian's dramatic descriptions of nightmare predators and psychological warfare. The creature's breathing, if that's what the rhythmic movement of its torso could be called, was shallow and irregular. Its skin, which should have been the deep, light-absorbing black described in the xenobiology texts, appeared pale and almost sickly. This wasn't a nightmare predator, Jamie realized with growing certainty. This was something that had been through its own nightmares. And as if sensing his scrutiny, the creature's large, multifaceted eyes slowly opened and turned directly toward him. The moment those multifaceted eyes locked onto Jamie's, the classroom atmosphere shifted from academic excitement to something far more primal. His classmates pressed back in their seats, crystalline forms dimming and gelatinous masses contracting into defensive postures. But Jamie found himself doing the exact opposite, leaning forward, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Krelian's voice carried the smug satisfaction of a professor who believed he was about to witness his students' worldviews crumble in the face of true terror. Notice how it immediately identifies the most dangerous presence in the room. Jamie almost snorted. Most dangerous presence? Him? The creature wasn't looking at him like he was a threat. It was looking at him like it was trying to tell him something. The nightmare wraith's predatory instincts are extraordinarily refined, Krelian continued, apparently interpreting the creature's focus on Jamie as proof of his theories. It can sense which individuals pose the greatest potential resistance to its psychological attacks. Humans, with their notorious unpredictability, would naturally draw its attention first. The creature, the wraith, Jamie supposed, shifted within its containment field. Its movements were slow, careful, nothing like the fluid, menacing, stalking behavior described in the xenobiology texts. If anything, it looked like it was having trouble staying upright. Havek's crystalline voice chimed nervously from across the room. "Professor, is it supposed to look so unwell?" Krelian's compound eyes swiveled toward his student, mandibles clicking with mild irritation at having his lecture interrupted. "Unwell? My dear Havek, what you're observing is likely the creature's natural hunting posture. Nightmare wraiths are known to appear deceptively vulnerable before striking. But Jamie had grown up on a wildlife rehabilitation farm back on Earth, and he knew the difference between deceptively vulnerable and actually suffering. The way the creature's breathing hitched, the slight tremor in its elongated limbs, the way it kept one arm pressed against its side as if protecting an injury. These weren't the calculated movements of a predator setting a trap. The beauty of observing a live specimen, Krelian warmed to his theme, is that we can witness behaviors that simply cannot be captured in recordings or biological samples. For instance, watch how it continues to focus on our human student. This isn't random, it's tactical assessment. The wraith's eyes hadn't left Jamie's face, and there was something in that alien gaze that made his chest tighten. Not fear. He'd felt that before. Real fear, when he'd been cornered by a territorial grizzly during a research expedition in Alaska. This was different. This was recognition. "Now, observe carefully," Krelian announced, reaching for another control on his lectern. "I'm going to introduce a mild auditory stressor. Nothing harmful. Simply a frequency that should trigger the creature's aggressive response patterns." A low, pulsing tone filled the classroom, and the effect on the wraith was immediate and heartbreaking. The creature flinched as if struck, its large eyes widening in what could only be described as panic. It pressed itself against the far side of the containment field, that injured arm clutching tighter to its side. Fascinating. Krelian's academic excitement was nauseating. See how quickly its demeanor changes? This is the beginning of its hunting sequence. The apparent distress is merely, "Turn it off." Jamie's voice cut through the professor's analysis like a blade. The classroom fell silent. Even the pulsing tone seemed to fade into the background as every eye in the room turned toward the human student who had just interrupted a senior professor mid-lecture. Krelian's mandibles clicked in confusion. "I beg your pardon?" "Turn off the sound." Jamie stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the wraith, who was now trembling visibly within its containment field. "You're hurting it." "Hurting it?" Krelian's laugh was like static. "My dear Jamie, I appreciate that humans have a tendency toward anthropomorphism, but you're projecting emotional responses onto a predatory alien species. What you perceive as distress is simply nothing." Jamie's voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to surprise even him. "I've seen enough injured animals to know the difference between aggressive posturing and genuine distress. That creature isn't preparing to hunt. It's terrified." Around him, his classmates exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to disbelief. Sindara's forked tongue flicked nervously as she whispered, "But the literature clearly states that nightmare wraiths are apex predators." "The literature," Jamie said, still watching the wraith, "might be wrong." The auditory stressor continued its pulsing rhythm, and the creature had now collapsed to its knees within the containment field. Both arms wrapped around itself in a gesture that was universally recognizable as self-protection. Its breathing had become rapid and shallow, and even through the alien features, its distress was unmistakable. "Professor," Havek's crystalline voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Perhaps we should—" She never finished the sentence. Later, the official Academy report would blame the incident on a cascade failure in the containment unit's power coupling system. A 1-in-a-million malfunction that caused the Class 9 containment field to fluctuate and destabilize. The kind of technical failure that safety protocols were specifically designed to prevent. But in that moment, as sparks flew from the containment cylinder and warning lights began flashing throughout the classroom, all that mattered was the shimmering barrier between a terrified alien creature and a room full of equally terrified students suddenly failing. The containment field collapsed with a sound like reality tearing. The classroom erupted into chaos. Sindara's reptilian form scrambled for the exit with a speed that would have impressed a cheetah. Blort's gelatinous mass flowed under his desk, apparently attempting to achieve some kind of structural camouflage with the furniture. Havek's crystalline body went completely transparent, as if hoping invisibility might save her from whatever horrors were about to unfold. Krelian himself had somehow managed to teleport behind his lectern, his compound eyes wide with the kind of terror that suggested his theoretical knowledge of dangerous predators had never included a practical component. In the midst of all this panic, Jamie did something that would be analyzed by xenopsychologists for decades to come. He didn't run. Instead, he took a step forward, toward the collapsed containment field and the creature that was now free to demonstrate exactly why nightmare wraiths were feared across 3 sectors. The wraith had fallen completely, too. The floor, when the containment field failed, curled into a defensive position that made it look smaller and more fragile than its 6-foot height suggested. It wasn't moving to attack. It wasn't phasing through matter or projecting waves of psychological terror. It was cowering. "Easy," Jamie said softly, the way he'd learned to speak to injured wildlife back home. "Easy there. Nobody's going to hurt you." The wraith's head lifted slightly, those large, multifaceted eyes focusing on him with an intensity that was both alien and deeply familiar. Jamie had seen that look before, in the eyes of a wolf pup that had been caught in a trap for 2 days, in a hawk with a broken wing that couldn't understand why humans were approaching instead of fleeing. It was the look of a creature that had given up hope, but couldn't quite stop wanting to be saved. "That's it," Jamie continued, slowly lowering himself to sit cross-legged on the floor about 6 feet from the creature. "See? I'm not going to hurt you. Nobody here is going to hurt you." Behind him, he could hear Krelian frantically activating emergency protocols and calling for security reinforcements. His classmates' whispered panic formed a background chorus of terror and confusion. But Jamie tuned it all out, focusing entirely on the injured being in front of him. The wraith slowly, carefully, lifted its head to look directly at him. Up close, Jamie could see that its translucent skin was marked with what could only be scars, some old, some disturbingly fresh. Its breathing was still labored, and the way it held that one arm suggested broken ribs or worse. This wasn't a nightmare predator. This was a torture victim. "Yeah," Jamie said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see you." I see what they did to you." And then, impossibly, the Wraith spoke. Not with its voice. Jamie wasn't even sure if it had vocal cords in any recognizable sense. Instead, words formed directly in his mind, transmitted through some kind of limited telepathic contact that felt like the lightest possible touch against his consciousness. "Help me?" The words whispered in his thoughts, carrying with them a weight of desperation that nearly broke his heart. "Please, help me." Jamie's breath caught in his throat. Around him, the chaos continued, security alarms blaring, his professor shouting instructions, his classmates fleeing for safety. But in that moment, sitting on the floor of an alien classroom light years from home, facing a creature that was supposed to be humanity's nightmare, Jamie made a decision that would change everything. He reached out his hand, palm up, in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. "Okay," he said simply. "I'll help." The Wraith stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, as if unable to believe what it was seeing. Then, with movements so careful they were almost ceremonial, it extended one of its own elongated limbs and gently touched Jamie's palm. The contact sent a jolt through, both of them, not painful, but electric, with possibility. And in that touch, Jamie felt the creature's story begin to unfold in his mind, like pages of a book written in sorrow and fear. Images flashed through the telepathic connection, a beautiful world of crystalline spires and flowing energy, populated by beings of light and shadow. Then darkness, ships descending from the void, weapons that turned paradise into wasteland, people screaming as they were rounded up like cattle for some unimaginable purpose. The creature, its name was something like a musical chord that Jamie's human throat could never reproduce, had been one of the survivors, one of the few who had been lucky enough to be captured rather than killed outright. What followed had been years of imprisonment, experimentation, and systematic torture designed to break its mind and spirit. It had been poked, prodded, studied, and tested by beings who saw it not as a person, but as a fascinating specimen of alien biology. It had been sold from one research facility to another, like a piece of equipment, each transfer bringing new horrors disguised as scientific inquiry. And finally, it had ended up here, at the prestigious Galactic Academy of Xenobiology, where it was destined to spend the remainder of its life as a teaching aid for students studying dangerous predators. The images stopped flowing, leaving Jamie sitting in stunned silence with tears streaming down his face, and a weight of rage building in his chest that threatened to consume him entirely. The creature, the person, Jamie corrected himself, looked up at him with eyes that held a lifetime of pain and the faintest, most fragile spark of hope. "I thought I was alone," the telepathic voice whispered. "I thought no one would ever see me as anything but a monster." "You're not a monster," Jamie said aloud, not caring who heard him. "You're not a specimen. You're a person, and what they did to you is wrong." Behind him, he heard the classroom door slide open as security reinforcements arrived. Heavy footsteps and the distinctive whine of stun weapons powering up filled the air. "Stand down, human!" Gorvex, the station's security chief, bellowed from the doorway. "Move away from the hostile entity immediately!" Jamie didn't turn around. Instead, he shifted position slightly, placing himself more directly between the security team and the cowering Wraith. "No," he said simply. The word hung in the recycled air like a challenge thrown down at the feet of the entire galactic academic establishment. And for the first time since the containment field had failed, the Wraith's eyes held something other than fear. They held hope. The standoff lasted exactly 3 heartbeats, long enough for Gorvex's security team to assess the situation, for Krelian to sputter indignantly about protocol violations, and for Jamie to realize that standing between an alien creature and a room full of trigger-happy security officers might not have been his most strategically sound decision. But then again, strategic thinking had never been humanity's strong suit, according to the galactic consensus. Human! Gorvex's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child. You are interfering with the containment breach protocol. Move aside so we can neutralize the threat. Neutralize? Jamie's voice cracked slightly, but he held his ground. You mean kill. The creature is a Class A dangerous predator. Standard procedure. Standard procedure is wrong. Jamie's interruption sent a ripple of shocked whispers through the growing crowd of onlookers. By now, half the academy seemed to have gathered in the hallway, drawn by the security alerts and the irresistible appeal of watching either a human get eaten by a nightmare creature or commit spectacular academic suicide by defying authority. Behind him, the Wraith had gone completely still, as if afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile protection Jamie was trying to provide. The telepathic connection between them hummed with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Gratitude that someone, anyone, was willing to stand up for it, and terror that Jamie was about to be killed for his compassion. Mr. Jamie. Krelian's voice took on the condescending tone that professors across the galaxy had perfected over millennia. I understand that humans have a tendency toward irrational emotional responses, but you must see reason. This creature is what? Jamie finally turned to face the room, though he kept himself positioned protectively in front of the Wraith. Is a person who's been tortured for years? Is someone who was stolen from their home and turned into a teaching prop? Is that what you were going to say, Professor? The silence that followed was so complete that Jamie could hear the distant hum of the station's air recycling systems. Even Gorvex's security team seemed momentarily uncertain, stun weapons wavering as they tried to process this unexpected narrative shift. Krelian's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of either deep thought or severe agitation. That's quite impossible. Nightmare wraiths are non-sapient predators. The literature clearly establishes. The literature is based on observations of traumatized prisoners, Jamie shot back, his voice gaining strength as his anger built. You've been studying torture victims and calling them monsters. To demonstrate his point, Jamie slowly reached out toward the Wraith, telegraphing his movements clearly so that everyone in the room could see his intentions. The creature, whose name was still that untranslatable musical chord in Jamie's mind, extended its own arm to meet him. The moment their hands touched, the telepathic connection flared brighter, and this time, Jamie didn't just receive the Wraith's memories. He pushed back, sharing his own. Images of Earth flowed between them. Vast wilderness preserves where injured. Animals were nursed back to health. Rehabilitation centers where creatures learned to trust again. The patient work of healing minds and bodies that had been broken by cruelty. Jamie shared his own memories of working with his family on their wildlife sanctuary, of coaxing terrified wolves back from the edge of madness, of teaching broken birds how to fly again. The Wraith's response was like a dam bursting. Through the telepathic link came a flood of its true nature, not a predator, but something closer to what humans might call an artist or a dream weaver. Its species, the umbral, had been healers and teachers, beings who used their natural telepathic abilities to mend psychological wounds and share wisdom across their crystal cities. They had been a peaceful people, so focused on growth and learning that they had never developed significant military capabilities. When the Harvesters, a nomadic species that collected exotic sentience for research and entertainment, had arrived at their world. The Umbral had been virtually defenseless. The images that followed made Jamie's stomach turn. The systematic destruction of a civilization, the capture of survivors, the deliberate breaking of their minds and spirits to make them easier to control. The Umbral had been sold throughout the galaxy as nightmare wraiths, their natural telepathic abilities twisted by trauma into something that appeared menacing to species who couldn't distinguish between projected pain and projected malice. "My name," the wraith whispered directly into Jamie's mind, "is Kethvar. It means one who mends broken songs." Jamie squeezed Kethvar's hand gently. "My name is Jamie. It means, well, actually, it just means Jamie, but I'm here to help you." The telepathic conversation had taken only seconds, but to the observers in the classroom, it looked like an extended moment of peaceful contact between human and alien. The kind of contact that shouldn't have been possible if Kethvar was truly a mindless predator. Havoc was the first to break the stunned silence, her crystalline form shimmering back to visibility as curiosity overcame fear. It's not attacking him." "Impossible," Krelian muttered, his academic worldview visibly crumbling. "The behavioral patterns clearly indicate—" "Professor," Sindara interrupted, her reptilian features twisted with what might have been shame. "What if the behavioral patterns are wrong? What if we've been wrong about everything?" The security team was beginning to look uncertain. Gorvex lowered his weapon slightly, though he kept it ready. "Human, can you communicate with the creature?" "I can communicate with Kethvar, yes." Jamie emphasized the name deliberately. "And Kethvar is not a creature. They're a person who has been systematically tortured and traumatized by the very academic institutions that are supposed to be studying them." Through the telepathic link, Jamie felt Kethvar's amazement at being referred to with personal pronouns, at being treated as an individual rather than a specimen. The simple dignity of being given a name, of being seen as someone rather than something, seemed to strengthen them. "That's preposterous," Krelian sputtered. "The psychological profiles, the predatory adaptations, the fear response they generate, are all responses to trauma." Jamie's voice echoed through the classroom with unexpected authority. "When you torture someone for years, when you treat them like an animal, when you strip away everything that makes them who they are, what do you expect them to become?" Blort, who had been hiding under his desk throughout the entire confrontation, slowly emerged with his gelatinous form quivering with emotion. But the research data." "The research data," Jamie said grimly, "is documentation of a galactic atrocity masquerading as science." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Jamie could see their impact rippling through the assembled crowd. Students who had spent semesters studying predatory behavior patterns were beginning to realize they might have been studying the systematic destruction of an entire species. Professors who had built careers on analyzing dangerous xenological specimens were confronting the possibility that they had been unwitting participants in a holocaust. Kethvar, sensing the shift in the room's emotional atmosphere, slowly rose to their feet. The movement was graceful despite their injuries, and for the first time, the assembled aliens got a clear look at what a nightmare wraith actually looked like when it wasn't cowering in terror. Kethvar was beautiful. Their translucent skin caught and refracted the classroom's lighting in patterns that seemed to pulse with their heartbeat. The elongated limbs that had appeared menacing in the confines of the containment cylinder now looked elegant, adapted for some form of artistic expression rather than violence. Most striking were their eyes, large, multifaceted, and filled with an intelligence that was undeniably sapient. "By the void," Havek whispered, "they're not a predator at all." Through the telepathic connection, Jamie felt Kethavar gathering their courage. When they spoke, it wasn't the direct mind-to-mind communication they had been using with Jamie. Instead, they projected their thoughts outward, allowing everyone in the room to hear their voice as a gentle whisper in their minds. "My people called this place the Learning Worlds," Kethavar said, their telepathic voice carrying harmonics of profound sadness. "We thought that surely beings dedicated to knowledge and understanding would see us for what we truly were. We hoped that someone, somewhere, would realize we were not monsters." The impact of hearing the nightmare wraith speak, not just communicate, but speak with eloquence and pain and hope, was immediate and devastating. Several students began crying openly. Even Gorvex's security team looked shaken, their weapons now lowered completely. "We were artists," Kethavar continued, their mental voice growing stronger as they shared their truth. "We were healers. We used our gifts to mend minds touched by sorrow, to weave dreams that could comfort those in pain. When the harvesters came, we tried to heal them too. We thought their cruelty came from some deep wound that we might be able to touch." Krelian sank heavily into his chair, his compound eyes reflecting a career's worth of certainty crumbling in real time. "But the aggression patterns, the fear responses, are what you created," Kethavar replied, and their mental voice carried no anger, only infinite sadness. "When you cage a singer long enough, eventually they forget how to make music. When you torture a healer long enough, eventually they learn only pain." Jamie felt tears streaming down his face as the full weight of what had been done, not just to Kethavar, but to their entire species, settled in his chest like a physical weight. Through their connection, he could sense other umbrals scattered throughout the galaxy, broken and alone, labeled as monsters in research facilities and private collections. "How many?" he asked aloud, though he already knew Kethavar would understand the question. "Few remain," Kethavar answered, their mental voice barely a whisper. "Perhaps a dozen, scattered across the learning worlds. The rest—" They didn't finish the sentence, but the images that flickered through the telepathic connection painted a clear picture of systematic extermination disguised as research. The classroom had fallen into stunned silence, the weight of collective realization settling over everyone present. Even the security personnel looked uncertain, their training suddenly inadequate for a situation that had shifted from containment breach to war crimes tribunal. It was Sindara who finally found her voice, her forked tongue flickering nervously as she spoke. What do we do now?" Jamie looked around the room at his classmates, at Havek, whose crystalline form was dim with shame, at Blort, whose gelatinous mass trembled with emotion, at Sindara, whose reptilian features showed a mix of horror and determination. He looked at Professor Krelian, whose entire academic identity had just been revealed as a monument to institutional cruelty. He looked at Gorvex and the security team, trained to see threats, but now facing the uncomfortable truth that they might be the real monsters in this scenario. Then he looked at Kethavar, whose large eyes held a mixture of hope and terror as they waited to see whether this moment of recognition would lead to freedom or simply a different kind of imprisonment. The decision, Jamie realized, wasn't really a decision at all. "Now," he said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had found their moral center in the midst of chaos, "we figure out how to make this right." Through the telepathic connection, he felt. Kethavar's amazement bloomed into something that might have been joy. For the first time in years, the last dreamer of Umbros 9 had found someone willing to fight not just for their freedom, but for their dignity. And if the galaxy's academic establishment didn't like it, well, they were about to learn why humans had such a reputation for being unpredictably dangerous when their sense of justice was provoked. After all, the literature clearly stated that humans were capable of surviving in conditions that would destroy most civilized species. It just hadn't mentioned that sometimes those conditions included moral compromise. The Academy's board of directors arrived 36 minutes later, led by Administrator Thel, a formidable being whose species Jamie had never encountered, but who radiated the kind of bureaucratic authority that transcended biological differences. She swept into the classroom like a diplomatic hurricane, her entourage of officials and legal advisors trailing behind her in perfect formation. "What?" she demanded, her voice carrying the crisp precision of someone accustomed to cleaning up other people's messes, "is the meaning of this disruption?" Jamie, who was still sitting cross-legged on the floor with Kethavar's hand in his, looked up at the assembled authority figures with the kind of calm that comes from having already committed to a course of action that will either change everything or destroy your life completely. "We're having a moral reckoning," he said simply. Thel's expression, insofar as Jamie could read alien facial expressions, suggested that moral reckonings were not typically on her administrative agenda. "Mr. Jamie, you are in violation of approximately 14 safety protocols and 3 interspecies diplomatic agreements. Release the specimen immediately and—" "Their name is Kethavar," Jamie interrupted, rising to his feet while maintaining contact with the umbral. "And they're not a specimen. They're a genocide survivor." The words hit the assembled officials like a physical blow. Whispered conversations broke out among the legal advisors, and Jamie caught fragments about liability exposure and institutional reputation management. But it was Havek who stepped forward, her crystalline form catching the light as she moved to stand beside Jamie and Kethavar. "Administrator Thel, we need to hear what they have to say." One by one, Jamie's other classmates joined them. Blort's gelatinous mass flowed into position with surprising determination. Sindara's reptilian form moved with the decisive grace of someone who had chosen a side. Even some of the students from other classes pushed through the crowd to stand with them. "This is highly irregular," Thel began, but Kethavar's telepathic voice cut through her protests like light through shadow. "We were never the monsters you believed us to be," Kethavar said, their mental voice reaching every mind in the room. "The shadow worlds are not realms of nightmares. They are refugee camps, survivors of the Harvester Wars, hidden in the dark places where civilized species fear to look." The implications hit the room like a cascade failure. If Kethavar was telling the truth, and the evidence was becoming increasingly undeniable, then the Academy's entire xenological classification system was built on a foundation of systematic oppression. "There are others," Kethavar continued, their telepathic voice growing stronger with each word, "scattered across your research facilities and private collections, broken by your studies, labeled as monsters to justify your cruelty." Thel's administrative composure finally cracked. This changes everything." "Yes," Jamie said quietly, "it does." The negotiations that followed lasted 18 hours and involved more legal documents than Jamie had ever seen in one place. But when the final agreements were signed, Kethavar walked free. Not just free, but recognized as a sapient being with full diplomatic status. More importantly, The Academy committed to a galaxy-wide review of all specimens classified as dangerous non-sapients, with Kethvar serving as a consultant to identify other survivors who had been misclassified. Jamie's formal expulsion from the Academy came through 3 days later, along with a notation that he was unsuited for advanced xenological studies due to excessive anthropomorphic tendencies and failure to maintain proper academic objectivity. He laughed when he read it. The real resolution came a week later, when Kethvar found him in the station's observation deck, looking out at the stars. "The Council of Hidden Worlds has made a decision," Kethvar said, their telepathic voice carrying harmonics of hope that Jamie had never heard before. "They want to meet with your species officially. Your actions have shown them that not all civilized races are civilized." Jamie felt a flutter of pride mixed with apprehension. What exactly does that mean? Through their telepathic connection, Kethvar shared images of vast networks spanning the galaxy's outer rim. Refugee communities that had learned to hide in plain sight. Survivors who had built new homes in the spaces between stars. Species that the civilized galaxy had written off as extinct or mythical, thriving in secret alliances built on mutual aid rather than exploitation. It means humanity has been invited to join something that no other advanced species even knows exists, Kethvar explained. A confederation of the supposedly primitive, the allegedly dangerous, the written off and discarded. We call ourselves the Forgotten Commonwealth. The irony wasn't lost on Jamie. While the galaxy's academic elite had been studying humans as dangerous death-world primitives, those same qualities had earned them recognition from the very beings who had suffered most under civilized rule. "There's something else," Kethvar continued, their mental voice taking on a note of barely contained excitement. "We've located 3 more of my people. They're alive, Jamie. Traumatized, but alive. And for the first time in years, they have hope." Jamie smiled, remembering something his grandfather had once told him about the difference between being educated and being wise. "Turns out," he said, "being called primitive by people who torture refugees isn't actually an insult." Through the viewport, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small revolution that had just taken place in a classroom on Epsilon Prime. But somewhere in those stars, other survivors were about to learn that they weren't alone anymore. And sometimes that makes all the difference in the universe.